Welcome back, everybody, to the deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at The Catcher in the Rye. And wow, do you guys send in a lot of material for this one? I think this is going to be a really interesting deep dive.
Yeah, it's a book that people really seem to connect with on like a deep level, and I can see why.
So just to refresh everyone's memory, The Catcher in the Rye follows this teenager named Holden Caulfield. And he gets kicked out of another prep school right before Christmas break. But instead of going home like a normal person, he decides to just wander around New York City for a couple of days.
Yeah, and he is not having a good time. He's running into all these people, but he can't seem to connect with anyone. He just keeps finding everything and everybody to be phony, and it's obvious that he's dealing with some pretty heavy stuff, you know?
Yeah, you could say that again. So today we're going to go way deeper than your typical English class book report. We're going to unpack what makes Holden's voice so distinct. We'll explore the symbolism that Salinger uses throughout the book, and we'll try to understand why this book still resonates with readers, after all these years.
The thing that really strikes me about this book is Salinger's use of first-person narration. Like, he just drops us right into Holden's head. You're experiencing everything from his perspective, feeling all his emotions, and you're hearing it all in his unique voice.
I mean, that voice is what really makes the book right. It's so cynical and funny and, well, sometimes he's surprisingly insightful for a teenager who claims to be sort of an atheist.
Right, and that's what makes him such an unreliable narrator. He contradicts himself constantly, which can be kind of frustrating as a reader, but it's also what makes him feel so real, so human.
Yeah, like when he calls himself an illiterate book lover. I mean, what does that even mean? But somehow it just makes sense coming from Holden.
Exactly. Salinger uses those contradictions to make you think. You have to figure out what's genuine and what's Holden just kind of lying to himself about. He'll say one thing and then like a few pages later totally contradict himself. It keeps you on your toes as a reader.
Now, I'm curious about those ducks in Central Park.
Yeah.
Seems like such a small detail,
Yeah.
but I feel like it actually says a lot about Holden.
Oh, absolutely. It seems like a simple question, right? Where do the ducks go when the lagoon freezes over? But when you really think about it, it's connected to this tension that runs through the entire book. Holden's struggle with change and the fact that he's growing up, whether he likes it or not.
It's like he wants to find a way to freeze time, to
Yeah.
hold on to those simpler times before things got complicated. He's afraid of what the future holds, of losing the people and places he loves.
Mm.
And the ducks represent that fear of the unknown.
He sees childhood as this pure state and adulthood as just full of hypocrisy and, phoniness. He wants so badly to hold on to that childhood innocence, but he's starting to realize that he can't stay there forever.
Which is where the museum comes in, I think.
Mm.
He keeps talking about how much he loves the Museum of Natural History because everything there is, perfectly preserved. It's like a snapshot in time.
Right. It's like he's trying to find that same unchanging quality in his own life, that sense of predictability, that things will always stay the same, the displays never change, the dinosaurs are always there frozen in their poses.
Yeah, but real life doesn't work like that.
Yeah.
And it's almost tragic because he's trying so hard to find that same stasis in his own life, but it just doesn't exist.
You can really see that in the way he clings to certain objects, like his red hunting hat.
Yeah, that hat.
Yeah.
It's almost like a shield for him, a way of separating himself from all those phonies he runs into. Like he's saying, I'm different. I don't belong in this messed up world.
It's such a powerful symbol. It shows his need to be unique, to stand out from the crowd. But it also shows how vulnerable he feels deep down. He wants to be different. But he also desperately wants to feel protected from all the judgments and expectations of the adult world. And what's interesting? It's like that whole idea of protection shifts when he gives the hat to Phoebe.
Oh, yeah, I see what you mean. Like he's trying to pass on that protection to his little sister, trying to shield her from the stuff he's going through.
Right, like he's admitting that he can't protect himself anymore.
Yeah.
That he's already lost that innocence that he's trying so hard to hold on to.
That's a really good point. So that kind of brings us to another important symbol. Holden's dream of being the catcher in the rye.
Right.
He hears this kid singing this song with that line, if a body catch a line, coming through the rye. And it sparks this whole fantasy in his mind.
It's a pretty powerful image. This field of rye on a cliff, and he's standing there catching all these kids before they can fall off.
It's like that cliff represents adulthood. All the things Holden sees as fake and corrupting.
Exactly. He wants to be the one to protect those kids, to preserve their innocence. But the thing is, he can't even save himself. He's already falling and he knows it.
So we've been talking about Holden's, obsession with the past. But how does that connect to his relationships in the present? Like he pushes everyone away, But he also seems to really crave genuine connection.
That's the paradox of Holden Caulfield, right?
Yeah.
He's this cynical teenager, but he's also incredibly lonely. He's always trying to reach out to people, making plans, calling them up. But those interactions almost always end badly.
Like his attempts at flirting with girls. I mean, he's trying so hard to appear mature and sophisticated, but he just ends up pushing them away.
He puts on this act, you know? Like he's cool and detached, but underneath it all, he's just a scared kid who doesn't know how to be vulnerable.
And then there's Jane Gallagher. She seems to be the one person he genuinely cares about. Like he sees her as this symbol of purity and innocence.
Yeah, Jane represents a time in his life when things felt simpler, more real. But, it's interesting that he never actually calls her.
It's like he's scared to ruin that perfect image he has of her in his mind. Or maybe he's afraid of rejection. That she's moved on, that she's not that same girl anymore.
It's that clinging to the past thing again, He's stuck in those memories, and it's preventing him from really connecting with anyone in the present.
Another thing that's interesting is how Salinger uses Holden's obsession with movies and books to kind of give us more insight into his personality.
Right. He devours pop culture, but he's also really critical of it.
Mm.
He hates the fakeness and artificiality he sees in movies and plays, even though he can't help but be drawn to them.
I always think about that line where he calls himself an illiterate book lover. What does that even mean?
I think it's another one of those contradictions that make Holden so compelling. He loves stories, he loves language, but he hates anything that feels pretentious. He wants things to be real and authentic, not all dressed up and phony.
So how does that connect to his love of Romeo and Juliet? Because he seems to genuinely be moved by that play, even though he claims to hate all that phony romantic crap.
I think he sees himself in those characters. He sees their passion, their defiance, their willingness to risk everything for love.
Even though he can't seem to find that kind of courage in his own life.
Yeah, exactly. He admires their authenticity, even though he struggles to be authentic himself.
So we've talked about Holden's cynicism, his loneliness, his obsession with the past. But we haven't really touched on his mental health. And I think it's pretty obvious that he's dealing with a lot more than just typical teenage angst.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Throughout the novels, Salinger drops these hints that Holden is seriously troubled. Like his constant negativity, his insomnia, his morbid fascination with death.
And he even mentions being in a psychiatric institution before the events of the book even begin.
Right. It's clear that he's struggling with some deep-seated issues, maybe depression, anxiety, possibly even PTSD from his brother Allie's death.
Yeah, Allie's death is like this unspoken tragedy that just hangs over the whole story. Even though Holden never really talks about it directly, you can feel the impact of that loss on everything he does.
He's trying so hard to avoid feeling that pain again, so he pushes people away, retreats into sarcasm and cynicism, and just avoids any real emotional connection.
And that just makes him feel even more alone.
It's a vicious cycle, And it all comes to a head in that scene in Central Park where he literally feels like he's disappearing, like he's losing touch with reality.
And that's when he decides to sneak into his parents' apartment to see Phoebe. Like she is his last hope, the only one who can bring him back.
And that reunion is so powerful because for a moment, Holden lets his guard down. He's actually happy to see her. He dances with her. He tells her about his dreams.
But it doesn't last long. Phoebe figures out that he's been expelled and she's devastated. She sees right through his act. And she challenges him to name just one thing that he actually likes.
And Holden really struggles. He can't think of anything except for Allie who's dead and Phoebe herself. It's heartbreaking because it forces him to confront how much despair he's feeling, how he can't find joy in anything.
And that leads him to decide to run away, to escape to the West and pretend to be a deaf mute.
Which is just another fantasy,
Yeah.
Another way of avoiding reality. But then something changes. Phoebe insists on going with him.
And for the first time, Holden realizes how much he's hurting the people he loves.
It's like he suddenly wakes up. He can't just run away from his problems. He has to face them. He has responsibilities.
And that brings us to the carousel scene.
That scene with Phoebe going round and round on the carousel, it's raining. Holden has a terrible cold. And yet he's overcome with this sense of peace and happiness. It's a beautiful moment, but it's also really complicated.
Yeah. I mean, it's like he's realizing that he can't stop time. He can't hold on to childhood forever.
She has to let go,
And it's like he's finally accepting that change is a part of life. And that maybe there's beauty in that too, even if it's painful.
Yeah, it's a subtle shift, but it's definitely there. And it leads to the biggest question in the book. Does Holden actually find redemption in the end?
Yeah, I'm still not sure about that ending.
Yeah.
But do you think he really changes? Or is he just telling himself a story? Because the book ends with him in this psychiatric facility looking back on everything that's happened, but we never find out what happens next.
That's what makes the ending so brilliant. It's totally open to interpretation. You know, Salinger just leaves you with this lingering question. Can a guy like Holden, who's so cynical and disillusioned, actually find his way back?
It definitely makes you think. Speaking of things that make you think, we actually got a great question from a listener about something we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
They ask, we don't see much of Holden's parents in the book. What can we infer about their relationship, and how might that have contributed to Holden's emotional state?
That's a really interesting point. Holden's parents are almost like these invisible figures in the story. We know they're wealthy, we know they send him to these fancy schools, but we never really get a sense of who they are as people or what their relationship with Holden is actually like.
Which says a lot in itself, right? Like that lack of parental warmth, that lack of a real connection. It definitely contributes to Holden's sense of alienation and loneliness.
Especially considering how much he criticizes phony adult behavior. It's easy to imagine him seeing his own parents as part of that world, you know?
And remember, he never actually goes home during the whole book.
Right,
He's constantly running away from school, from social situations, from his own feelings.
Yeah.
And maybe he's running from his parents too, avoiding that confrontation, that potential for disappointment.
I think you're right. And it just emphasizes how important his relationship with Phoebe is. She's like this one source of unconditional love in his life.
She sees right through his BS, but she loves him anyway. And maybe that's what he needs more than anything. Not judgment, not lectures, just that genuine human connection.
And maybe that's why The Catcher in the Rye has resonated with so many people for so long, It speaks to that universal desire for authenticity, for connection, for that feeling of belonging that Holden is so desperately searching for.
Oh, hey, another listener asks, why do you think The Catcher in the Rye has stayed relevant for so many decades?
I think there are a few reasons. First of all, Holden's voice is just so memorable. It's raw, honest, and often hilarious. It perfectly captures that feeling of teenage angst and alienation that so many people can relate to no matter what generation you're from.
Like he makes you feel like you're not the only one who feels lost and confused and just fed up with the world sometimes.
Exactly. And then there are the themes that the book explores. The struggle between innocence and experience, the search for authenticity, the fear of growing up and losing that sense of wonder. These are all things that we grapple with at some point in our lives.
Yeah. Even as adults, we still have those moments where we look back on our childhoods with nostalgia or worry about becoming jaded and cynical, like those phonies Holden hates so much.
And finally, I think The Catcher in the Rye has endured because it's a book that's open to interpretation. There's no one right answer. The ending is ambiguous. Holden's an unreliable narrator. And there's so much symbolism and subtext that you can find new meaning in it every time you read it.
It's the kind of book that sparks conversations and makes you question things and stays with you long after you finish reading it.
Exactly. And that's what we're all looking for, right? Those books that make us think and challenge us and stay with us.
Absolutely. So to wrap up our deep dive into The Catcher in the Rye, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from this?
I hope it inspires them to revisit the book with fresh eyes, to really pay attention to the nuances in Holden's voice and all the layers of meaning that Salinger packed into the story. And I hope they'll come to their own conclusions about Holden's journey and the nature of innocence and experience and all the challenges and possibilities of growing up.
Maybe even ask themselves, what would I be the catcher of?
Yeah, what do I want to say from falling off the cliff? That's a great question to think about.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Holden Caulfield.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.